Buongiorno, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for waking up at this ungodly hour, showing your commitment to use identity in your applications. My name is Vittorio Bertocci. I work as a program manager in the Identity and Access team at Microsoft, and I specifically focus on developer libraries and integration with developer tools, such as Visual Studio and similar. Today, I'll bore you with how to take advantage of Azure Active Directory in your applications, all kinds of applications, web applications and native applications. Now, that leads to kind of an unfortunate conundrum. Those are really two sessions, but for the session budgets, I had to shove two sessions into one. And even one session would be difficult to cover everything. So I'll do my best to give you the distill of the information you need to be successful on this, but it's going to be difficult. Also, I'm going to actually subdivide these in two basic sessions, because the share part is really just the identity side. Like if you outsource identity to Azure AD, that's the part that is shared across the two application types, native and web. And then what's left are only the differences. So I think it's just clearer if I present to you these as two different segments. And then whenever there are similarities, I'll go with that. How many of you guys have a Visual Studio installed on your machines? Excellent. How many of you guys open it at least once a day? Fantastic. Anybody who uses a different IDE, like Atom, Sublime, VI? Oh, Heroes, fantastic, very good. Thank you. So for all the people that did not move their hands, or they are deep asleep, which I understand, I would as well if I wouldn't have to be here, if you are not a developer, you're going to be even more bored. So the time to take advantage of all the other sessions is now. We have 4 doors that you can use for like storming out and reaching something that is more apt to your professional path. If you choose to stay, you are welcome to do so, and I thank you personally, but please don't write in the eval, oh, it was all for developers, because it is entirely by design. So let's start with native applications. But before I go in there, in this session, I'm not going to sell you Azure Active Directory. I expect you have been sold already by the higher level sessions earlier in the week. How many of you guys went to an overview of Azure AD this week? Not a lot. How many of you guys went to the various office sessions? Not a lot. Great. So I hope you did some reading, but being this 400, I can't really do a lot of introductory part. The thing I just wanted to take a second to remind you before we start diving into the technical aspects is why it's really a good idea to integrate with Azure AD. And it's also something you can feed to the, money decision makers. Like, I guess that you guys make technical decisions, which I also like to do. But sometimes people ask you, like, why should we do this? You want to play with the next shiny toy. You just want me to spend money. Well, in this case, there is a very solid business reason behind all this. We have 5 million organizations already using this. So if you sell software as a business, this is an enormous audience that you can take advantage of, well, in the best sense of the word, as in you can cater, not to take advantage in the... I realize that people can take stuff out of context, and so I'd be in trouble. So I don't mean it in a bad way. And also, if instead you have your own company, you want to protect your own assets, this thing is pretty much one of the biggest identity systems on the planet. Since we started operations, we processed 1 trillion authentications. I can't even wrap my head around that number. So if you are searching for something that will stay up, now I hope I'm not jinxing it, but things that are extremely, extremely high availability, then this is the system that you want to take advantage of. Also, if you want to integrate it to any capacity to the Microsoft ecosystem, so send a mail via Exchange, query an Azure subscription, and start virtual machines, anything that you want to do with our APIs, the only currency that our APIs understand are tokens issued by Azure Active Directory. So if you apply all the things that I'll be telling you about in your applications, you'll be able to partake in this very powerful system of APIs. And that said, my marketing hat. Whoop. All right. Native applications. Now, when you build native applications, which, by the way, I define a native application as anything that does not run inside a browser, basically, you have two big choices. You can use the building tools, the building blocks that are offered by the platform. So, for example, if you target iOS, you'll have Objective-C and all its libraries and all the native components that live in there. If you're targeting Android, you will have Java. If you're targeting any Windows platform, C# is the most popular option. So you can go that direction. And of course, if you are native to that platform, that's the natural thing to do. However, when you are targeting a platform that you are not used to, you have two choices. You can go native, like learn this specific part, or you can use another pivot. You can have like a language that you are especially attached to, say C# or JavaScript, and there are frameworks that you can use for using that language that you are used to and target that same platform. And of course, there are trade-offs in here. And developers can really get very passionate about those choices. And in fact, I like to make the comparison with food. How many of you guys are outside of the US? Come from outside the US? All right, excellent. And even in the context of the US, everybody has regional cuisines. Like we are all experts in the cuisine of our area, so we can really appreciate the fine differences between two different restaurants and similar. But when you travel to a different country, if you decide to eat like a local, sometimes it works out, sometimes it's more challenging. Like a couple of years ago, I was in China and I was walking by Beijing, and I shot this picture. And I like to think I'm open-minded, normally Italians are not very open-minded with food. We are absolutely set on our stuff. And I like to experiment. But I looked at this and I kind of, that's how I feel when I look at Objective-C. And thank you. Thank you. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that I'm not used to it. Like there are those methods that have to end with the first parameter that you have to use. Why? I don't know. So I'm not very comfortable with it. On the other hand, I have guys on my team, the guys that wrote our libraries for iOS, that absolutely swim in it. They love it. They are super effective. They are far more effective than me, which instead, given that my main phone is an iPhone, and I like to develop for it, of course, and I use frameworks. And of course, the frameworks have trade-offs. Yeah, I can use C#, I can use JavaScript, but if, for example, I'm using C# and I want to use the camera, I need to find out some library for getting there. So there are, advantages and disadvantages. And instead, this next picture represents the other choice, like you are traveling, but you want to find something familiar, so they stuck. And I want to thank Will and Stay, that took this picture from Taiwan recently. I asked them, please find a Burger King in Taiwan and take a picture for me, because I want to show it in the session. And that's pretty much what happened 4 years ago. I was in Taiwan, and I was doing a fantastic banquet, really, really good. I was with an American colleague. And as soon as we walked out of that place, the guy said, let's go to Burger King. I said, why? We just ate a lot. No, that was experiencing. Now I want to eat. So I don't say the name because he might want to sue me, but that's a true story that actually happened. So if you feel that way for the platform that you want to target, clearly you can be an iOS person and look at C# and feel exactly the same and say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I want to use JavaScript. Perfectly fine. So coming back to our technical part, here, those are the most common platform that you want to target with your native apps. iOS devices, Android, and any flavor of Windows, from Windows 7 on the desktop all the way to the latest universal apps. You can choose to leave at the native level. You can choose to use these platform stacks. During the first half of this session, you'll see that we have many of those, many things that we can use to help you to take advantage of all of those options. So you can pretty much choose whatever you want, and we'll have something. In fact, I even came out with a slogan that rhymes: choose any platform of DevStack, Azure AD has your back. And English is not even my first language, so. All right, so in this first part, I want to break this down into 3 steps. I'd like to first tell you about all the tasks that you have to perform if you are a native application and you want to take advantage of a modern identity system. So this is a high-level pattern that applies across the board. So not even just with AD, but with anybody. Then I'm going to explode the various options that we have for all the different platforms. And I'll dig into Windows 10, I'll mention Windows, I'll mention iOS and Android and similar. And then after that, I'm going to describe what are your options using Xamarin and using Cordova. How many of you guys ever used Xamarin? Many, very good. How many of you guys ever used Cordova? Huh, not a lot of overlap, very interesting, thank you. And now that I'm already asking you questions, let me keep going for a couple more. How many of you guys work with iOS directly? Okay, thank you. How about Android? All right, perfect. Thank you. So without further ado, let's go with a pattern. And for the pattern, I have to drop out and do my thing. Okay, what do we have here? Here you have the classic, let me just get to the right one. Yes, here. So here you have a classic topology that you have when you create a mobile solution. You have your device, and you have a remote resource that you want to access. This remote resource, in our case, is going to be Exchange, SharePoint, Azure AD, or your own web API. And on the device side, instead, you can think of a device as really as 2 parts. There is the set of resources on the device, so storage, the ability to know the position of a user, the internet connection, all those things. And then there is a sandboxing environment which isolates applications from the actual resources and acts as a gateway so that it enforces that application can do only the things that the end user consents to. So applications don't have direct access to the resources, as in, for example, as you would have on the Windows desktop. So you are always decoupled by this. So you need, somehow it creates a set of laws of physics, and your application needs to operate within this part. Now, what does it take for that application to have access to that resource? Typically, that resource will need every call to present some kind of a credential, something which proves to the resource that the caller does have the right to have access to it. So how do you go about getting it? You will have some kind of authority, which of course, given that our sponsor is Microsoft, is Azure Active Directory in this case, which will hold the ability of authenticating users. So in the case of Azure Active Directory, that would be all the users within one organization, and there will be ways for your app to engage with that and send, for example, raw credentials, username and password, pins, smart cards, whatever is on the menu for the day, and give you back this token. So the first capability that your application needs to have is the ability to craft messages that can engage with this authority. There are multiple protocols that you can play with, and here we'll be talking about OAuth and OpenID Connect, but if you use our libraries, you are kind of decoupled from it. You need to know mostly if you want to implement on a platform where we don't have a library. So you can use any of the standard libraries available in there. The other thing that you need to do is the ability of popping out prompting behaviors, as in you need a way to engage with your user so that the user can enter their own credentials. And then every platform will have its own way of showing UI, it will have its own Chrome, it will have its own rules for performing that. Once you have all of these, let's see if my pen today works. Doesn't always work, but today it works. You can gather those credentials, you can send your message crafted according to the protocol that you want to use, It's not very clear. Let me make it whiter. Yeah, look at that, a very white message. And once you have this, if everything goes okay, your application, your authority will create what we call an access token, which is the credential you need to present to the resource. And you will send it back to your app. And once you have that, then you will simply use whatever protocol the resource requires you to use, which typically in the REST world is OAuth. So you just attach this token in a header, send it over, and the resource will just verify that it's you, verify that you have the correct rights, and give you back whatever is needed. And now every good demo of every other company I know ends here. Because, oh, I got the token, I got the resource, happy ending. But not really, because you will likely want to keep talking with that resource. And you don't want to go for this little dance every time, of course. So you need some way for this token or for the ability to get this token to stick around. So you need some more logic in your application or in the system. Like this red stuff represents logic, which can sometime live in your app, sometime for certain platforms will be native to the platform. You need some capability that actually saves this token somewhere so that it's around for you to reuse. So those three capabilities, support for the protocol and creating messages, support for prompting the user with some UI, managing the session, are the fundamental capabilities you need for your mobile apps, regardless of the platform, regardless of the authority. Now let's be a bit more specific about Azure Active Directory. Now this is all the same scenario. I'm just expanding this a bit. As I mentioned, I want to go into the introduction for Azure Active Directory. Just think of it as your repository of users, groups, and application in the cloud is a projection of your on-prem directory if you have one, or it can be natively cloud, like you might have no directory at all and just have everything in the cloud. And it's a multi-tenant system, so every org has its own. So in this case, I have Contoso, which I heard the stocks went up this week for all the technology stuff that they demonstrated. And here, basically, that's, I would say, all the elements that you'll want to deal with. And the way in which you engage with this is through a set of endpoints, which are a bit unfortunate. I don't know if they are very visible, but at least you can read the writings. And here, I'm just like, for completeness, added SAML and AWS Federation, just to remind you that they are there, but also for highlight that we don't use those at all for the mobile case. For the mobile case, we use the OAuth authorization endpoint and the OAuth token endpoint. So we do exactly the things that I described earlier. So we have this capability of creating a message that requests authentication using a specific protocol, which in this case is OAuth. And interestingly, here we do use the authorization endpoint. How many of you guys are familiar with OAuth? Lots. Very good. So for everybody else, the authorization endpoint is an endpoint designed to serve UI. It sends back UI, and this UI can be used for gathering credentials and for presenting the user with consent prompts. Now, in our libraries and in our approach in general, we use these. So when it's time to prompt the user, like we did earlier, let me pull out my prompt. Where was it? Here it was. When you prompt the user, in reality, the only thing that we are providing from our app is actually, from our library, is actually the frame and the browser surface where we render this. But the UI actually arrives from the server. This is enormously advantageous in respect to approaches we had in the past. I recently just felt it directly on my skin. Our IT decided that it wasn't good enough to use username and password, and so they started enforcing second factor auth. So now every single time I need to authenticate with my Microsoft employee identity, I put my password in, and then my phone rings, and I have to put another PIN through my phone, which is embarrassing if you do it during attending a conference and you forget to turn off, which did happen to me a couple of days ago. So sorry. So you have a one for free. If you do it, I'll forgive you because I just did it myself. I will forgive you anyway, of course. But the good thing is that IT made this decision and flipped the switch on the server side, and no client had to be redeployed, because thanks to the fact that we popped this thing, this is entirely in the hands of the server. So this is an extremely flexible thing. And of course, this also allows not just two-factor auth, but other levels of engagement with the user. The good example of this being the consent. Like, it's not enough to give you a username and password. Sometimes the user needs to know what's going to happen. So that's the function of that thing. And then once you do this little dance, you get back a code. This is a detail that you might not need to know. And our libraries transparently take this code. I'd like to get the focus here. Yeah, sometimes the pen decides that it's time to go to sleep, so I will use the mouse because I'm resourceful. I'm telling that to myself. And engage to the token endpoint. And then at this point, let's add a bit more details. Earlier, I've shown you that I get a token. In reality, I get a collection of tokens. Here, in this case, I will get a couple of tokens. And the one that I care about at the moment is the access token. It's the access token that I can use for calling my resource. Let's see if the pen woke up. Nope, the pen is dead. Yeah, the demo gods have been angered. I knew I shouldn't have eaten steak yesterday. Oh, here is our call. And here comes into play the thing that I said earlier. Like, this token will eventually expire. So I could just keep it in memory and keep using it, but we keep the expiration time of the token very short for revocation reasons. Say that the user obtains this token and starts calling resources, and we find out that the guy embezzled some resources, and so we show him the door. Now, this guy will have access as long as the token that he sends is valid for the resource. So we want the time to be as small as possible. On the other hand, usually we don't catch people embezzling, and so usually the user will still be valid at the time at which the token expires. So how do we go about not prompting the user again once we need to get that other token? Well, we have this other token, which we call a refresh token, which we can actually use once the token expires to play against our token endpoint, and we can get back a fresh access token without having to ask the credentials again, which is pretty nice. And our refresh tokens have a sliding validity of 90 days. So potentially the user can sign in today and then for 90 days not be bugged again. In our libraries, we wrap all the logic for knowing whether we have to give you the cached access token or if we need to use this refresh token. It actually goes a bit farther than this. The refresh tokens that we get from AD are special. They are similar to the Kerberos ticket granting tickets. How many of you guys are familiar with Kerberos? Yeah, look at this. I thought only people with white in your beard, but instead I've seen also a lot of young people. Excellent. Thank you. So in Kerberos, you get this meta ticket that you can use for obtaining other tickets. The interesting thing is that our refresh token behaves exactly in the same way. So say that I got a token for Exchange, and now I want to call Azure. I don't have to go through that dance again. I can just take the same refresh token that I got for Exchange, send it to AD, and then I will get back a token for Azure automatically. As you can see here, I helpfully use the same color for the other resource. Now, there is one last thing that I want to mention here before I move on. One rigid rule of Azure Active Directory and of good, solid identity systems in general is that the authority will not issue a token unless it knows absolutely everything about your scenario. It needs to know who is the client application. It needs to know what are the resources that you want to access to. And it needs to know that in advance this client is asking for the resources in there, so that we can render the consent experience, so that we can put the correct scopes in the refresh token, so that when you try to do this trick that I just explained, we know that it's legit. So you can think of having a little picture of your scenario inside AAD, and I'll show you how you can actually make that happen. All right, that's the end of the theory for the natives. So now let's get into the details of how we actually make this happen. And we are going to cover these 4 main platforms. I will talk about Windows 10 and the news that we have in there. I will mention how to deal with Windows without the new goodness that we introduced in Windows 10. And then in passing, I will mention iOS and Android as native. So let's talk about Windows. Now, all I said earlier about sandboxing, in which, like when you create an app, you need to play by the laws of physics of that platform because you are constrained by it. Well, the good news for us is that on Windows, it's our own stuff. So if we decide that we want to dig a bunker somewhere because we need it for off, we do it. And that's exactly what we did in here. Like Windows 10 is like very much a son of this era. And clearly, the ability of doing off is absolutely fundamental. So we decided that this belongs to the platform in itself. So when you are targeting Windows 10 universal Windows apps, you don't need libraries. You can actually use system APIs. And this system is actually designed to be extensible so that you can, as an identity provider, plug yourself in and partake in all of these mechanisms. So how does this work? The idea is that Windows comes with a number of what we call web account providers out of the box. And specifically, we have one provider for Azure Active Directory and one provider for MSA, the artist formerly known as LiveID. And those guys actually look exactly like the same provider, and I'm just sharing with you that below the scenes there is 2, but from your point of view is exactly the same. And those things live in the OS, and they have access to shared resources, such as, for example, the collection of system accounts. So what happens is that when you authenticate using this mechanism, you can actually feed the list of accounts that the system sees. So once you authenticate in one app with a certain user, then this user might end up being available also to other applications without having to sign in again, which is really, really handy. And always under the control of the end user, of course. They will always be prompted for permissions. And you can also have some extensibility level. Like say that you have your legacy identity system and you want to participate into this, you can write your own provider. I'm not going to touch on that. I'm just saying that it is a possibility. Now, all this lives inside. Had I known, I would have sucked in my belly. Sorry. Now you'll see me with a big belly in the picture. At least I wasn't on a side otherwise. I'm so vain. Jesus, I'm so vain. So how do you expose this capability to your application? Well, as you know, the Windows Universal apps use an extension of what we had before in terms of a Windows Store APIs. And we do have one new API, which we call the Web Account Manager, which sits on top of all these providers and abstracts away all the details. So you use exactly the same API. You might need to adjust a couple of things if the provider that you want to use needs special parameters, but the API that you use is pretty much the same. And so that's pretty much what happens. And let me just add a couple of things so that when I save the slides, you have it. Okay. And here I could walk you through the slide, but we like better to play with the code. So let's switch to our fantastic number 7, and let me demonstrate, provided that I remember my password. Did you get it? Did you guess? All right. So here I have a very, very simple application. Let me just show you how it works, and then I will dig in the code. So in this application, all I'm doing is getting a token from Azure Active Directory, and then querying the directory to get my thumbnail, my image. And then I can take a picture with a camera and upload it. And it's all very easy because it's all REST APIs and similar. So let me hit this little button. Here I'm calling the local APIs, and I get prompted for my credentials. So today I want to be Mario. I forgot to shave. Okay. One thing that I didn't mention is that in Windows 10, you can actually sign in on the device with your Azure Active Directory account. In which case here, I'd just go through a heated knife through butter. I wouldn't be prompted. I'd just use the same identity that I have on the box. But here, this machine is actually tied to my domain. And so, OK, so now you can see my current picture in there. And then now, let's see. It takes only a specific segment. So I have to be exactly in that corner. Oh, very good. And so now I can upload this guy. OK. And now the next time, once I show you the same app from a different platform, you'll see that my pufferfish face is in there. OK. So let's see how we made this happen. Once you saw all those lines going back and forth, you might think that I have loads and loads of protocol code. But in fact, I don't. Here, it's very simple. Let me make this even bigger. Let's see, 150. OK. So the first thing that you do when you want to take advantage of this capability is to get an account provider. As I said, we can have multiple account providers in the system. Out of the box, we come in with the AAD and MSA one. And here, if you want to use one of the Microsoft out-of-the-box ones, you have exactly the same code. You provide the moniker for the provider, which in our case is loginmicrosoft.com, which covers both MSA and AAD. And then you specify your authority, which basically means what is the organization that you want to talk with. In my case, I want this specific authority, so it's a line of business app. But I could, for example, say generically, I want all possible AADs. If you are building software for third parties, you don't know in advance which directory you want, so that's what you would use. So in that case, you just have a string that says organizations. It's like a shortcut. If you'd want instead to use MSA, because you want to call APIs that are supported by MSA, you'll just say consumers, and this would do the job. Then once you have this reference to your provider, you create a web token request. A web token request contains all the salient elements for your request. So in this specific case, I'm declaring what is the identifier of my application in Azure Active Directory. Remember that AD needs to know everything. So I need to say, hey, I am this client. And then in this case, I'm also influencing the behavior. Given that I do this demo all the time, usually my user is already cached in the system. But I wanted you to see the experience. And so here, I passed this option, web request prompt type, force authentication. So I'm guaranteed that this stuff comes out. If you want single sign-on, you might want to omit that. And then in Azure AD needs to know what is the resource you want a token for. So here, I'm adding a resource for that. And then I simply do this request token async. And then I extract my access token. And once I have my access token, I just attach it as a REST call. So very, very, very straightforward. Very, very simple. OK. Am I back in here? Yes. Good. So that was Windows 10. Now, let's say that you also want to target. OK. Here in your reference, I added this slide which tells you a bit of a Harry Potter spell you need to use for registering today an application to use this capability. This thing will get much, much simpler as we get closer to general availability. I just wanted to make sure that if you want to play with it, you are not blocked on this. But pretend it isn't there. This is not the slide you are looking for. Very good. So say that instead of sticking with Windows 10, you need to address existing platforms. So we can go all the way back to Windows 7. Windows 7, and then, of course, we have a Windows 8 store applications, 8.1, and we have a Windows Phone 8.1 store applications. So how do you do that? Well, if the platform does not provide that capability natively, then we package it into libraries, we give you the libraries, and then you can use those libraries for doing that. And for these, we have this library, which is really a family of libraries called Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL. How many of you guys ever used it? All right, thank you guys. So we support it on many, many platforms, as I mentioned earlier. And it's, of course, open source, so you can go on GitHub. I'll give you the link at the end of the talk, so you can go file bugs, add issues, contribute features. If you are so inclined, please do. And what it tries to do is to provide consistent primitives. That it gives you a consistent way to think about your problem, but in each and every platform, we behave like first-class citizens. So in iOS, all of our methods end with that first parameter that I mentioned earlier. On Android, we use the calling pattern, which is typical of Android, with all the fragments and stuff like that. When we are on JavaScript, we use promises. So every time we go on a platform, we try to blend in. We don't bring any C#ism in there. But the high-level primitives remain the same primitives. And many features, not a protocol library. You can use this thing for performing tasks and without worrying about the protocol that we actually use. In fact, please don't do that. Otherwise, if we change the way in which the library works, we might break you. So here's how it works. We try to give you artifacts which represent all the elements that you see in the problem you're trying to solve. So we start with the directory that you want to use. We have an object called authentication context, which represents your directory. This is a bit different from what we have seen in Windows 10, in which we have a static object, and then we just pass the directory that we want every time. Then we need to represent the resource that we want to get, and we will need to represent the client that we want to use. And we have primitives such as this acquire token, in which we specify the identifiers of the resource and the client. And then we have something for representing the result, which is the authentication result, which contains all the tokens that you need. So you can get it from your call, but you can also get it directly into your cache. And yep, let me show you exactly that from the counterpart of the same code that you have seen on the other one. So here I have a good old WPF application, which with very small fonts does the same thing that I said earlier. So here we have a classic pattern. Basically, I just call, I have my authentication context, which is tied to the same directory tenant, developer tenant on Microsoft.com. And here, this is a very classic pattern that you can use. You can first try to get a token, saying I want a token for my resource, I am this client, using this acquire token silent, which is guaranteed to never show any UI. And this thing is used when you are doing background work, and you don't want to risk to interrupt the user. And then if this fails, you can actually fall back to the full acquire token call, in which you can expect the prompt to come out if it's necessary. Now, one interesting thing of ADAL on .NET Desktop is that we don't really know where you want to save the tokens. Because when I'm on a sandbox environment, I don't have many options. So there is an obvious default for us to save tokens. But on the desktop, there isn't. Also, you can use the same library, as we'll see in a moment, in a middle tier. And even there, we don't know where you want to save them. You might want to save them on Redis or on Azure Table or on Amazon S3 or any other place that you decide you want to use. So in this case, we give you the ability of providing a custom implementation of your cache, which is what I'm doing in this sample. I'm just giving an implementation of a file cache, which uses my local encryption for saving it. And we have many samples which show you all of these, so I won't go into the details. So let me just demonstrate to you that this works. So I want to search for Mario. I know this guy. So as you can see, this was exactly the picture that I took earlier, so this works also across platforms. Very good. I need to pick up the pace a bit, so sorry if I will speak too fast. So what I use here is ADAL.NET. ADAL.NET is one NuGet library which contains many different libraries. It contains an assembly for the .NET desktop, and then it contains Windows runtime components for Windows Store and Windows Phone 8. So that means that when you run on those last two platforms, you can get all the languages that the Windows runtime supports, so also JavaScript and also C++. However, the vast majority of our customers is using C#. So if you go through these other languages and you find some interesting bugs, please fill issues on GitHub, and we'll do our best to fix them. And on the desktop, we have some extra things that you can do, like, for example, using directly username and password, which normally we never allow for the reasons that we said earlier. Having that dialog that pops out is really very, very flexible, and that's the preferred way of doing this. But for legacy apps, or like if you want to write a command line thing that you script, then we also support that with severe limitations. So how do I choose between these ADAL, which, by the way, also works on the Windows 10, just like any Windows Store app, on the Web Account Manager? Pretty easy. If you wanted to target only Windows 10, go with the Web Account Manager. Like, you have all the advantages of living directly at the system level. If you need to target any other platform, like any other Windows, or even with Xamarin, iOS and Android, then ADAL is probably the choice that you should go for. Eventually, ADAL is going to be so intelligent that once it wakes up and it finds out that it's operating within a Windows 10 app, instead of using its own logic for making requests, it will turn and use the Web Authentication Manager. So at that point, there will be no difference. You'll be using ADAL, and this thing will use the system. So it will be just a matter of taste, as in if you already used it one model, if you prefer the other model, or if you are talking also to providers that are not just AAD or MSA. ADAL iOS. ADAL iOS is an Objective-C library. Again, you can find it as a source on GitHub, and we also make it available on CocoaPod. And it uses some specific features of a system, of course, so it's all native Objective-C, and it uses the keychain. So all the apps that you publish as a publisher will be able to share the same keychain, and so you can actually share tokens across your apps, which is pretty handy. And that's one. I knew it would happen. I was saying, it happened. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. OK. Instead, for Android, of course, that's based on Java. And of all the things that you can do in Java, such as you can deliver this thing in many, many different ways. You can, of course, do the usual clone. You can use Gradle. You can use Maven. And can I make a request? Can I have a dream theater? It's more in that. It's more of my personality. And also there, we do use features that are specific to Android. So we use the Android Key Store, and specifically for Android, but this will happen with iOS as well. If you download the Azure Authenticator app, we do use it. We integrate with it. So when you use ADAL and on your device, you have the Azure Authenticator app, then the Azure Authenticator app acts as a broker, and is kind of behaving like one of those providers that I described in Windows 10. And so you can share tokens across the board. It's very handy. And we have detailed samples, and we have detailed walkthroughs. And I'll give you all the links at the end of the talk. So I'm not showing these simply because I have so many other things to show, so I had to cut things somewhere. But please check it out if you are a native developer on any of those two platforms. Very good. So now let's look at the multi-platform goodness. Xamarin. You have seen many that use Xamarin, and also I've seen James walking in. James. Ta-da! Thank you, James, for being here. If you have questions on Xamarin, he's the man. And just to give you a very quick idea of how this works, the idea is that thanks to various different runtimes, you are able to write C# applications and actually run it on iOS, Android, and of course on different flavors of Windows. And the way in which this works is that you'll have a shared code base which is portable across platforms. You can share these by actually sharing the code, like having a project which gets linked multiple times, or you can have a portable class library, which is my personal favorite. And then you can have all the platform-specific logic still written in C#, but on platform-specific projects, so that you can take advantage of the specific features of a platform, such as user interface elements, or storage accounts, or like the way in which you pop out the UI, all of these things that can be specific to the platform. So how does ADAL help in here? So we have a preview of the next version of ADAL, which is out. You can download and play with. We have samples, we have walkthroughs, which is still a NuGet, but instead of having just Windows artifacts in it, it also has these platform-specific assemblies. And if you use these in Visual Studio, every time you add a reference to ADAL, the NuGet Manager system will understand what is your typical project and decide what are the correct things to provide. So say that you have like your common logic that you want to use across the board. Like in our sample, we have a directory searcher in which we have a component which performs the search. Now, you create a portable class library in your own project, and when you add a reference to ADAL, you actually get just the portable class library version of ADAL in there. And here you have all the entire surface for calling and getting tokens, and you can just call it from your component. The only thing that's missing here is a parameter which we ask you to valorize at runtime, which represents a pointer to the application in itself. We use that for dynamic injection, so that once we wake up and we find out that this pointer points to an iOS element, then we can pick up the correct logic for saving tokens, for presenting prompt to the user, and so on and so forth. So say that I am in an iOS project. When I add the reference, I get both the portable class library and the iOS part. And then at this point, I can just reference my PCL project, and I will not need to write any identity code in the platform-specific stuff. I'll just get it straight from my PCL. And to give you an idea of how this might work, I'll just show you in Visual Studio, but then I'll run it on a Mac, hoping that the Wi-Fi is still alive. Hello, Wi-Fi. Are you still alive? Maybe. So here I just want to show you the project structure. Yeah, some other time. Come on, come on, come on. Okay. Anybody suffer from motion sickness? I like to do it. I find out that the evals go up if I make my audience feel sick. Stockholm syndrome, I guess. So what happens here is that, as you can see, I have one top project, which is by this portable. And in there, I'm putting all my logic for searching the directory. So that's the place where I call my acquire token. And then I have many other platform projects which just reference that project. And then in here, once they call that element, they also pass this pointer to their own owner window, so that the ADAL knows which platform they are in, and it can dynamically choose what to show. And to show you this in action, I have to go to 6. And here, every time I see it, I'm in awe. This is a Xamarin Studio. And what you see in here is a C# code, which I wrote on this very machine. But this one is a Mac. And I can actually hit the moral equivalent of F5, and it runs on a Mac. It's like, how did you guys do it? This is unbelievable. So let me just actually show you that. Here I'm just hitting my F5. So the system starts the iOS emulator and runs exactly the code that I had in here, but on iOS. And of course, everything is too big for this guy. Let me scroll it. OK. And so here, very easily, I can search for Mario. And here, I get my sign-in. So I want to search as myself, Mario. Developer tenant on Microsoft.com. And here, I know you want to see my password, but I am very sorry. Ain't going to happen. So have a nice view of this while I type my password. Now I'm hoping that I wrote the correct one. Otherwise, I'll have to do this little dance again. Oops, wrong one. Thank you. This one is number 6. Why do I have to bring so many platforms? Can't I just use virtual machines? No. Ta-da! I found myself without even going to India. And this wasn't unscripted. It just blurted out. So it works. It works pretty well. And thank you, James. This is fantastic. I love it. So let's go back to our slideware and accelerate a bit. So let's talk about instead Cordova. Cordova takes a different approach. The idea behind Cordova is that they provide you with a frame which is designed to load from a local from a local repository HTML, substantially HTML and JS. And this platform is designed to, I'd say, use a system of plugins that surface in JavaScript APIs the capabilities of the underlying platform. So that's pretty much what we have done with ADAL as well. We created a plugin which has 2 parts. It has a plugin in itself which provides you with a facade in JavaScript. A facade that you can use regardless of the platform that you go to. You just use the same JavaScript. And then, when you add a reference to this plugin, depending on the platform where you are also going to get the native flavor of a DAL for that app. Now, this is important because if you just use our, for example, JavaScript library that we use for the web, then that library is designed to live inside a browser with all the limitations that come with it. So it tries to make do with it, like using hidden iframes, all sorts of tricks for maintaining state. Here, we don't need to. We can just go straight into the device. So if you are on Android, you are doing this trick, and you have your Android Authenticator app, you'll be able to use it just like you use it when you are on the native directory. So pretty powerful. So basically here, you just end up getting your app, and your app talk to our plugin, and the plugin talks to the native, and the native talks to the device. So very straightforward. And so we are back on the Mac, which is 6. So goodbye, Mario. And here, I like to use the, you can use these from Visual Studio, but I really like the command line capabilities of Cordova. You can do everything with just a couple of lines. So here you can see it because it's teeny, but it says Cordova emulate iOS, which is always Patronus iOS for me, if you are a Harry Potter geek. And so what happens here is that this thing makes a dynamic deployment. As you have seen, that little logo that was the Cordova frame loading. And the app is already there. I just needed to scroll it a bit. And it's exactly the same app that I've shown earlier. But in terms of code, this is teeny. Like this is the HTML that I need to use for the UI. So very straightforward. And all I need to do for making my call is pretty much here. You can see the exact same pattern that I used on .NET. I try to get my token silently. And here, if it fails, I actually go and I make the full call. I'm just using the JavaScript syntax. And this teeny piece of code will allow you to target iOS, Android, Windows Phone, Windows Store, all of the platforms that we support in this respect. And just to show you that it works, Mario. And why didn't I get prompted? I didn't get prompted because I wanted to show you that I'm using actually the native part. And here I'm tapping the cache. Like I already used other native apps written in ADAL in this context, and I'm tapping from the same cache. So that's for demonstrating you that, yes, it's JavaScript, but it's also native. So it's really in the box. And we are back to the slideware. So first part of the talk is done. I hope that what you have seen helped you to understand how to use those red boxes. There's really, really a lot more to learn on how to do this. Like this is just the bare scaffolding you can use for, let's say, dig deeper. And again, I'll give you more links afterwards. So web apps, nice pink web apps. So when we talk about web apps, I said earlier, anything that runs in a browser, that's a bit of an overgeneralization. In the classic web app scenario, you have round-trip-based apps, which I pop out of the browser, I get a resource come back, I render whatever comes back, I click on something which requires another resource, I do an entire round trip come back. So that's the classic pattern that we've been using for the last 20 years. New pattern that we have seen earlier, basically, is a native client which calls a web API. A web API is also a web application. It just happens to serve things to software which is different from a browser. So instead of sending back HTML, it usually sends JSON or XML, but the principle is the same. And then, of course, there are these very modern flows in which those front ends becomes middle tiers, and the code behind your application requires programmatic access to other resources. So if you ever got one of those annoying requests of tending to the farm of your friends on Facebook, then that's the pattern that you are seeing. Like those are server-to-server calls that are leveraging the Facebook platform. And we can do, and we do the same from your web app when you want to call Exchange, SharePoint, and similar, hopefully for more productive reasons than giving water to a guy I haven't seen in 10 years. And then, oops, we went too far. And then there is finally another pretty modern approach, which is the single-page application. This is a model in which you still use the browser, but instead of doing these continuous round trips, you compose your interface using JavaScript, using the DOM, and then you update single parts by making web service calls. So you're doing these calls from JavaScript, so you're behaving a bit like a native client, but you are within the browser. And of course, this has a different way of being secured, given that you might, for example, call APIs outside of your domain. So for example, you cannot use cookies. And even in this case, we have red stuff everywhere. This thing doesn't exactly rhyme, but it's close. So I hope you guys will be tolerant of my poor marketing skills. And here, the idea is that I'd like to walk you through all of this stuff. And of course, we have only 16 minutes. So or I start talking in Italian and really fast. But I don't think it will be a good use of your time. So I'll do my best to cover everything, give you pointers to how you can find out more. So here, pretty easy and pretty straightforward. This is how it normally works on. And the pen is still dead. I thought it would wake up, but nope. So here there's how it works in the classic round-trip app, which is the base of everything. You have our usual AD, and what happens is that your user tries to call to your web app. We have this artifact, which we call middleware, which is a component that lives in the pipeline of your app, which intercepts calls. And if a call doesn't present any valid credentials, craft a message, like an authentication request, and redirects the user to Azure AD. Once again, we go to the authorized endpoint, which is the one that renders things. And now at this point, let me see what I can use. I will use this one. Okay. At this point, if everything goes well, AD issues a token, and then this token gets automatically posted in here. And then now the middleware finds again a request and finds this token and needs to decide if this token is good. How does it decide it? Well, there is this document in Azure AD which describes how Azure AD issues tokens. So it tells you what keys it will use for signing the token. It tells you what is the identifier of this specific instance. So Contoso will issue tokens saying, here there is the identifier of Contoso. And the Fabricam will do the same with a different identifier, so that if your web app only wants people from Contoso, it will be equipped to validate the token and make sure that's the case. And we do this automatically by querying this document. Now, this document changes. We roll the keys. And in the past, this would have meant lots of support calls saying, hey, my app stopped working. But now, with our new middleware, we actually dynamically obtain these keys, so your application is self-healing and you don't need to worry about this aspect. But once everything works, your middleware creates a cookie and sends it back. And from this moment on, we'll just keep sending cookies back and forth. Or pretzels, if you are from Germany. Anybody from Germany? All right, pretzels. Excellent. So the way in which this happens is, again, we have these components. Those are middleware components which use OWIN. OWIN stands for Open Web Interface for .NET. It is a specification that describes how you can write software for processing HTTP requests, which can be rehosted. So instead of being tied to IIS like you were in our past flows, now you can actually just create this component and then run it in self-host, for example, or use it with Nancy FX, which is not ASP.NET. So you have far more flexibility on how to move these around. Also, I'm not talking about these in this talk, but all the capabilities I'm describing here are also available in ASP.NET vNext. So if you're using ASP.NET 5, then you also have versions of these that work in 5. How do you actually do this? Well, you can easily just go on GitHub, take any of our samples, and clone them. And we designed these so that you need very few lines of code to initialize this. However, if you are like me, which I want to do the bare minimum for getting the salary. So I use Visual Studio. And Visual Studio has nice tools that will help you to automatically wave in the components and the logic that you need for inserting this middleware in the pipeline. And it will also reach out to Azure Active Directory and automatically create the entry for your app in there. And I'm going to do that. So let me close these other ones so that we recover some memory. How many of you guys downloaded Visual Studio RC? All right, you should do it. It's pretty awesome. In Visual Studio RC, we have this new feature in which you can actually associate to your Visual Studio your accounts. So here I associated my account with my Azure subscription. And now Visual Studio can use my tokens for acting on my behalf. So when I create a new app, it can use this token for creating this app without me having to actually retype my credentials every time. And of course, now it will turn out that they are expired and I will be proven wrong. But let's hope not. So here, let me just go ahead and create a new project. And I want to create a new web project. Web application free sounds like a good name. I know, right? Remember, the bare minimum for getting a salary. So here I have a wizard when I can choose these work and school accounts, which represents my organization. And here in this dialog, I already have the list of all the directories that my users have access to. So I can easily select any of these directories, like those are like my development environments, without having to remember any of those. And I want, you guessed it, developer tenant. And here I can also say, well, I want my app to have access to directory data. So I want my app to be able to call into an API, which is the aspect I wanted to talk about slightly later. So here I hit OK, I hit OK again. And then I download half of the internet in form of nuggets, because that's what ASP.NET likes to do. Despite my protests, I still do it. And then after that, you'll see a little swirler, which will say that it's provisioning things in Azure AD on my behalf. So it will be taking the address of this app on IIS Express. See, that's what's happening. It will use it for saying, OK, this is the URL of this app. It will create some identifiers and then just push everything in the cloud. And if I have this, in theory, I should be able to just hit Google Chrome and use this application right away. Sometimes there is a bit of lag, especially if others are using the same stuff that I'm using, and it doesn't create the app right away. And given what happened with a pen, my guess is that this is going to happen here as well. No, it didn't. Very good. So here I am already hitting my web application free and automated name. I can go to the portal and change it to a better name. Or I could have used directed name, but it does not require that. Like web application free is a bit anonymous. I want to be the admin today. So what happens here is it's the very first time that I'm running this. So I'm prompted for permission to grant a permission to this app to sign in as myself and get access to my directory. And there I have all my details about the publisher. And if I accept, go back and forth, and voila, it just needed to be cranked a bit. So as you can see, I set up my application very, very easily without really having to write any code. But let's see what was the code that was generated. It's code that I could have written myself pretty easily. So if I go in application start, you have a startup off. And here you have basically what's needed for making this happen. So let me go to 150. The important lines here are these. Set default sign-in authentication type is just like boilerplate code. It just says you can, how to say, create multiple authentication pipelines, which you use when you want to mix different authentication types. Here I just want one. So I will create one identifier, and I will latch all of my components in my pipeline to the same identifier. It's cut and paste code, so even if you don't fully understand it, don't worry. The second part is also boilerplate code. It just says, I want to keep a session for this user. So it's not just one shot in which I get the token and I authenticate you. I actually want to reflect a valid authentication into a cookie, which keeps track of my session. So that's the function of that thing. And then here I have my middleware, which says I want to use OpenID Connect. And here I just pass these few parameters, which represent the identifier of my application, the directory that I want to use, and my redirect URI, which is just specifying where I want it to come back to once I sign out. And all those things come from my web config, but they could be anywhere. And they are all very straightforward. So my authority is simply joining the domain with the AAD instance. So it's just my directory. My client ID is just the GUID that I get back when I create the app in there. So all very, very straightforward. And here, basically, I'm just telling you in a slideware form. Now, what happens when I want to call an API? Now, in OpenID Connect, I have this very nice pattern in which when I obtain my token, together with my token, I also obtain what we call a code. Let's pretend that this is a code. With a pen, I can actually write it, but with my wrist is not high resolution enough to write with a mouse. And this code is an OAuth code that from my code behind, I can actually redeem so that I can use ADAL.NET in the same way as I did on my native clients for hitting the token endpoint. And in this token endpoint, I can present the code, present my own credentials as a web app. When I create my web app, I also get a key. I could also use a certificate if I want. And what happens is that I get back a set of tokens, just like the tokens that I described earlier. I just added the ID token. Feel free to ignore it for the moment. Now, at this point, what happens? I use my ADAL for getting those tokens. I want to keep those tokens around because when I run in a web server, the web server can kind of decide at any time to just fold the house and go home. So here, I need to save these tokens someplace. And that's where ADAL and the cache that I described earlier come in. We have various samples which show you how to save the cache on an entity framework database, or how to save it in the session in a cookie, or how to save it on Azure storage. And the idea is that when I receive this code, so just before my application even starts, I can redeem this code, get this token, and save it in this cache. And then later on, when during the usage of my app, I need to use that token for calling my API, I will again create my authentication context with the same cache instance. And then I'll just ask for a token, the usual acquire token silent. And given that I'm using the same cache, then this thing will just deliver to me the access token, or will automatically use the refresh token, and so on and so forth. The moment in which the 90 days elapse and I need to get a new authentication, I can't really redirect the user right away because I might be disrupting their flow. So in our samples and in the code here, we just present something in the page saying, in order to call this API, you need to authenticate again, so that the user can click on it. And when the user clicks on it, it just triggers another sign-in. So very straightforward. And in terms of code, this is all in our controllers. So before I wisely hid this other part of my initialization, in which I have this authorization code received, which is an event that I can handle. And in this event, I do use my ADAL for creating a new instance of this authority. I pass the cache in, and I use the acquire token by authorization code for redeeming it. And from now on, I have this token in my belly. And now when I go in the user profile, I actually use the exact same pattern. I just reinitialize my authentication context, and I use the same cache. So at this point, every time I make the call, this thing will deliver me automatically the tokens that I need. And you have seen it earlier when I hit the user and I valorized it. Now, I still have very little time. I just wanted to mention that we do have a model for calling single-page applications. So if you are an application that calls a web API from JavaScript, we have a library that you can use directly in your client, which is written in JavaScript. And together with our middleware on the server side, you can simply get tokens and cache them directly in your JavaScript. We have controls for saving it per session or for local storage so that you remain signed in. And we have mechanisms for renewing these automatically. So it's a very simple model, and this has been covered in a number of different sessions this week, especially from the Office guys that use it all the time. So I'll reference you to that part. So hopefully that gave you an idea of, for all of these topologies, we do have a solution for you. If you want to dig deeper, we have a very nice, very fresh, we just built it, guide for developers, which is subdivided by application type and by platform and similar. We have an enormous amount of samples that are very expensive to maintain, but we do it with joy because we like to serve our customer. All the code of our libraries is in GitHub. And even if you don't want to contribute, very bad community, even if you don't want to contribute, one thing that I love of this is that I can actually get the symbols, and I can F11 inside the library when something goes wrong. And that is of enormous help. So it's really nice. Like, the ability of getting to the code is nice. And if you have issues, please hit us on the issues on GitHub. We are usually very responsive. And if you have questions, we are monitoring actively Stack Overflow, and those are the two main tags that we use. Azure Active Directory is generic, and ADAL is just for libraries. And that said, I am actually went over. So thank you so much for coming and staying all this time. Thank you. Thank you. And basically, this was the only session I had, so I am yours. I'll go in the booth, and if you guys have questions, come and I will entertain you or give you a headache, depending on what you ate. Thank you.